everybody. I'm Jordan Tenenbaum, social media manager over here at Celigo, host of the Technology Leaders podcast. I'm joined as always by Mark Simon, my trusty co-host, our vice president of strategy.
Hello.
And today we have Chris Bach, the CSO of Netlify. Chris, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
Thank you.
Yeah,
Good to
man.
be here. All good.
Great to have you here. Thanks for joining us. We're going to jump right in. So, anyone who's done a deep dive on your LinkedIn sees that you have a pretty diverse past, but I was wondering if you could talk to us and the listeners a little bit about kind of how you became the CSO at Netlify. What led you to that position? How'd you get there? Tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll do it quick, but yeah, I started way back in the day, setting up computers and office networks and so on back in Copenhagen, Denmark, where I'm from, just to make some money. I fell into a movie studio and started editing, and it was always in advertisement commercials, and became an editor there, worked with film, became a line producer and other things. And later, when I went back to university to study film and media science, I started then a company on the side, and it was I wanted to do more sort of interactive storytelling. I had a film background. My co-founder of that company had a multimedia background. He was sort of the first batch of the Flash animators back then, and we created this agency, this hybrid agency of Flash, which was this old animation standard for the web that could employ partial videos, right? So it's not like a big YouTube player; it was more sort of video elements. And we did that in Denmark when it was not a thing. So totally betting on a market trend that didn't exist, but I was studying on the side and so on, and then it all blew up. Like, so overnight, we it sort of everyone wanted one, and we were the only game in town. So we ended up with sort of, I think, 9 out of the 10 largest agencies as clients, and by then 19 out of the 20 largest companies. And I did a lot of bells and whistles for a long time. I wanted to get closer to the middle, right? And by that I mean, like, I wanted to have more strategic impact, be closer to clients, make sure that whatever we were doing wasn't just about winning awards, but also moving market shares and so on, right? So I ended up selling it to a full service agency, and as part of the merger, I became the chief digital officer. And I was working there when my co-founder of Netlify, whom I've known since high school, Matt, he was already in San Francisco, and he reached out to me back almost 10 years ago now, the first time he was reaching out, right, with this notion that he had gone and become CTO of the largest web agency in Spain. They were doing 20 websites a day. So you can imagine how many people that involves, and that you need to build an internal machine, right? Like, you need freelance designers to plug into that and everyone else. And so you end up with essentially a fully hosted WordPress, right? Or something to that extent, a content management system. And so when the crisis hit in 2008, they were like, why don't we take this? We've already built the system, make it as a standalone system, and sell that as software as a service to other agencies, and came to San Francisco with that. And that's when he sort of noticed that regardless of if you're choosing one content management system or this commerce solution or Sitecore, whether it's enterprise or not, the layer underneath it, the architecture layer, was starting to suffer, right? We were all sort of dealing with the notion that, hey, maybe we'll end up with the web in walled gardens, right? There was sort of Facebook pages and the kind of the like that. And mobile had exploded, come out of nowhere, and all of a sudden it was a huge part of everyone's world, right? And mobile was, of course, driven by apps more than websites, right? And what Matt approached me around was what I thought was the premise of doing business online actually had a root cause. And that was all tied into the fact that, in a simplistic way, we can say that the legacy web runs as monoliths. That means that if you have a website, right, you're running that on a computer somewhere, on a singular server, right? And then everyone that visits from a browser, and the server will render a whole version of that website and send it to you back, right? And that means computing for every visitor, which means it's not very scalable, which is why back then we always had the /start effect, or if a startup came on Hacker News and made it to the front page, those 15 minutes of we hear everyone was, well, you just got a lot of 502s because you couldn't get through. And it's in other words, it wasn't fast or scalable enough. And what I always like to tell the story that when Steve Jobs presented the iPhone for the first time, it was, of course, in a PDF. all those icons, they were links to apps. Oh, sorry, to websites, right? The notion of apps didn't exist. It was only when we collectively found out that pulling in the UI every time you're going to turn a page wouldn't scale. Phones weren't fast enough, broadband wasn't fast enough. So we end up with this notion that why don't we pre-build that application and then have the phone's operating system run it and execute it. And then, of course, if you have Spotify, you're not going to have all the music in the world, so you're going to need some of the content from somewhere else. But essentially, we decoupled those two things. And Matt Nelson was sort of like trying to think of the same for the web. And we already had Git come out, right? When he started Webpack, the most common feature request was FTP access. Like no one knows what that means, right? Like 5 years later, right? It was all about Git. But also JavaScript had become very mature, and the browser, very key, had become a full-fledged operating system. It used to be a document viewer, right? And then lastly, you had the API economy. Everything is an API. It's beautiful, right? You're not going to run your own payment gateway. Of course not. You're going to speak to Stripe or PayPal or whatever, right? And use that. And you can have your first-party microservices as well running. And so the need for their website to run everything was going away. And it also, if you looked at it from other points of view, it was really time for a change, because in that world, if I choose, let's say I'm a marketing coordinator and I weigh in and I say, well, I like this way of editing my content, that's great, right? But that would lead to a choice of software that would also dictate the template engine, the build tool, the programming language, the server environment, the website output, all of it, right? Those are not decoupled, which doesn't make a lot of sense, that the need of a marketing coordinator dictates everything that will go on technically, right? And so what we thought was that, hey, if you could decouple the front end from the back end, right? If you can actually pre-build the website to some extent, and you could then have multiple points of origin. You wouldn't have to compute for every visitor. That means that would be fundamentally faster and more scalable. It would also remove the largest surface area of attack we know, which was the old monoliths running for every visitor, right? Like, of course, from a numbers game, if you have something like Drupal or WordPress, right, there was a lot of automated malware out there knocking on doors across the internet saying, hey, if you haven't updated your website for a week or two, we'd love to infect it, right? So that decouplement makes sense. But as we dove in, it made even more sense in the fact that when I started, like, my pains were often that, where you have control as an agency, but I would say the same for most marketing departments and anyone really producing websites. It's very often in the strategy, in the communication, in my design, and my front end. But then I had to send it off for implementation, wherever that was. If you're lucky, you get, they make some tickets. 3 months later, you get something back. And I'm not sure if anyone is old enough to remember, but it didn't look like what you sent to them, right? And you're like, I have to take a screenshot of the PSD, make it semi-transparent, and like go and hold it over the site and see that's not the same font. Like, no one will notice. The client will notice. Let's just assume they will, right? And so in essence, that was because your front end, your digital experience, your UI had to be part of that singular backend, right? So it had to be implemented into it. Now, in the new world, it would be decoupled. So that means that I could push that digital experience live, and then it would just pull in information from the backend, pull in from these headless APIs. And doing it that way meant that there's no implementing into. And so what that meant for my time to market and my control and my quality was huge, right? So I got really excited about that. And then the last thing is, at that point, I had sat with very large clients that, some of the biggest companies out there that were, they had these very big marketing software clouds, right? They're also called like digital experience platforms that would have your CMS and your builder, your website builder. It would have your commerce. It would have analytics and a bunch of others pulled into one thing. And I saw these enterprises really struggle with saying, well, we need to go to multilingual, right? Like, because we need that over here. The system doesn't support it. So I guess we're spending the next 5 years building out an monolith, porting all the content, feature freezing, and then 18 months later, you're live with something. That's painful, right? And that was because, again, it was all locked in. You want to change one thing, you have to change all of it. And in this new world, because the output wasn't a UI, right? Because it could stand alone as a headless API, I could see at length this decouplement could lead to this composable workflow that Gartner talks about today, right? This notion that you can mix and match different components, right? Which also makes so much more sense to do that when you have more needs. Because remember, back then we had limited services and we had 1 or 2 digital touch points. Now we have thousands of services and 20 digital touch points, right? So having one monolith built equally well for all of them is also almost impossible, right? And so this notion that you can mix and match and therefore gradually update your tech stack so you keep having something that's current and solving your needs and a fast enough time to market, rather than having something that seems relatively fit for a few years and then you go into the 6-7 years where it's I wish we could do something else, but we already invested so much, the sunk cost fallacy, right? And so all of this made me super bullish, right? Okay, there's a real thing to solve for. But of course, it also made us think, why isn't everyone doing this, right? Like this doesn't make any sense. Like this is a fundamentally better way to build, no matter who you are, how you look at it. And there was 2 reasons. One, there was no ecosystem, and 2, there was no workflow, right? And so when you don't have the glue code, when you don't have a monolith that has all that stuff under the hood that you never think about, of how everything fits together and how it's published and hosted and all those things, all of a sudden you needed sort of a platform that could take these components, plug it into a developer workflow with unified release management, and then distribute it out and take advantage of this notion of having multiple points of origin and so on. And all of that had to be automated because there was too many moving parts. And of course, we can't build the ecosystem. We need the ecosystem to do that. But we could build that workflow platform. And so that's why we founded Netlify. And then since then, today we're a Series D company. We have around 4.5 million businesses and developers on the platform. They run around 35 million sites, stores, and apps. But also the ecosystem has, and it's hard to know exactly, right? But at least 3,500 companies instead of the 2 when we started. And that's because even like there's so many new services. If you look at anyone that has done an e-commerce service in the last 3 years or 4 years, even like it's headless natively, right? It's composable. It's built in this way. But also all the existing large providers, they saw that, hey, either we innovate and we go headless and we composable, even if it does mean being a little less sticky, or that we're just not going to be chosen and we're going to be obsolete in a few years, right? So if you look at Gartner, for example, composable was a thing in 2020, but it was, it was a few percent. Now they said that here in 2023, in January, so in the beginning of the year, said 70% of all enterprises, according to Gartner, would build with this technology, this architecture this year. So in other words, it's really, really happened. And today, Netlify really focuses on the large organizations that have to do this at scale. So they're not just talking about one greenfield project. They're more talking about how does this new architecture fit together with all the old architecture. So we sort of expanded our workflow story to also wrap around the legacy stacks and so on, but specializing completely in the digital experiences, which is why it's fun to be on this podcast as well, because I think a lot of that idea of saying what we do is we automate the pain away. Right? The traditional way of building a website would be, now I'm done with my front end, and then you have a system administrators, and they have a tick in their own sprints, right? To spin up staging environments. And you have the same for database environments, and then you have your varnish caching, your DevOps people, you have your infrastructure engineers, and we're not even talking about QA steps and security scans. And that's why it takes 4 months to move the blue block from here to here, right? It's not because it takes 4 months, but it's because like every one of those have sprints and ticket systems and so on. And for us, it's not that we take over that as a managed service, not at all. It's that it's completely automated away. It's not like we sit and do it for you. It's because all that operational orchestration and infrastructure has become code. And so it's really saying, hey, to those developers, spend your time not on maintenance and on running and this kind of operation and orchestration, but on building out the parts. And I would bet, Mark, that part of the value add is probably pretty close and similar for Celigo, right? In what you all do, but of course in another end of the stack. But this notion of saying, hey, these parts should be automated. Let us do that for you.
Yeah, it's interesting. Through very different parts of an organization, we're solving a very similar problem, which we think of it a little bit more. We're more maybe on the business process and business application side, but a modern business has evolved their system. A modern business's system stack has evolved to be hundreds of SaaS applications surrounding maybe and the older they are, maybe there's legacy stuff at the core. If they're a more modern organization, probably like yours, certainly like Celigo, I know, because I know our inside, we're born in the cloud. And so we don't have anything that's non-cloud, but it's still, we have, I'm sure your organization has hundreds of SaaS apps you're using, just like us. And so a modern business is that composable, the business, it really needs to be one system. If it feels like multiple, you don't have a successful, and that's really what we do, is help bring those composable pieces, all those different SaaS apps together into one system. And my take here is really at Netlify, you're doing that from a digital experience for those organizations, and bringing those composable pieces together into a single experience, but really similar concept, just applied very in two very different ends of the spectrum. Yeah,
100% right. That's exactly it.
So
yeah, that's go ahead, Jordan.
Well, I was going to say it's interesting because it's two ends of the spectrum that are kind of opposite, but also kind of overlapping, which that's just interesting to even hear how business can be applied in that manner. But I'm curious. We deal with integrations a ton at Celigo, and I mean, we sell them, we build them, we maintain them, and I know Netlify deals with them too. And so I'm kind of interested if you could talk a little bit, Chris, about how you guys deal with, build, maintain integrations, and then from there, Mark, I'm wondering if you could kind of comment on Celigo's methodology with building, maintaining integrations, and I want to see if they're kind of that same, similar but different. So I'm wondering if you could go first, Chris, and then Mark, maybe you could provide some clarity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so from our point of view, right, it's really about those digital experiences, right? Whatever ends up being consumed by UI somewhere, right? And then saying, hey, you're gonna have, as an enterprise, just like Mark said, right? You're not gonna, the privilege of just having one system to fit it all is not there, right? Like, you're gonna have a lot. We work with some companies that have like 400 to 600 brands in 200 countries, and they're closing in on 100,000 unique digital executions a year. So it becomes, never mind the individual systems. Yeah. Let's talk about how do they fit together? How do we provide common workflows for them, right? And then I ultra focus on that part that makes up the orchestration, operations, and so on of the digital experiences. So the way it would work is, as I mentioned before, right? There is that notion of running all that traditional infrastructure and all those processes to create a live production of let's say a website, right? And an interesting one there is just a little stat there. And on average, our enterprise clients, we sort of got those numbers recently. They deploy to production once per week, which is a lot better than once a month or once a quarter, which it used to be not long ago, right? And on average with Netlify, it's 28 times a day. And that's even if that's after we remove all the outliers, because we have some that's thousands of times, right? And I wish I could say it was because our software is 150 times faster. That would be really cool. But in reality, it's just because all those extra steps that used to, again, have these tickets and the manual oversight and so on, right? They've been automated, right? Like, and if you think about how modern deployments go, you just push your code to Git, and there is no step after that. We automate it. We bring you back an infinite, there's infinite staging environments, and that way you just get a URL, right, that you can play around with. And every time you do that, you're using those plugins to use AI to see if why you built would have failed if there was an error there. You're using security scans like Snake.io and so on, right? You're using continuous code quality monitoring like from Digma or whatever it might be. But this continuous everything, this idea that it's not an end state. It's something I want to do throughout, which also means that individual developer is presented with whatever needs fixing and optimizing at the very beginning, rather than a team that's different that gets in the very end, right? So all of that really drastically reduces time to market. And that opens the door for doing a lot more experiments and stuff you wouldn't do if it took all those weeks to go live. But that workflow and having a global multi-cloud application delivery network where I mean, we sit in the marketplaces of AWS and GCP and so on, right? So it's not that we're an we piggyback on those data points that's provided from of those points of presence that are provided from those cloud providers. But then we are able to create this workflow where all of that just becomes automated away. There is no caching header. Basically, it's set by default by upfront, right? And it's always as fast as it can be. So there's a workflow in that we provide. Then there's the layer on top, which really is this developer workflow where they need something that really automates into Git. They need a unified release management, right? And you also need, when you have this and you have all these different things that are, maybe you have more than one CMS and you have common systems and so on, right? Where are your sources of truth? If you're seeing something locally in a CMS, for example, in a previewer, well, if that hasn't been built out and pulled in all the other things and you don't have a real URL at the end of it, are you sure that what you're seeing is what you're going to get? And so in that workflow, we also have deploy preview commenting, where that staging environment has a visible overlay that automatically integrates into Asana and Trello and GitHub and all these things, where you can now type directly what it is you want changing, right? So that becomes part of the workflow that extends a little further than the developer. And then there's really this notion, this layer of what we call the Netlify Connect, if you look at its product, but it's complete sort of integrated part of the platform, really. And that's the notion where you're saying, well, you have all these content sources, right? And some of them, they really need to come through a unified layer. They need to be readily accessible for a digital experience, so you're not waiting like 20 seconds to get that information from an old CRM or something, right? You wanna make sure that that's cached. And you want to make sure that they can wrap around your legacy stacks as much as your modern ones, right? And and that combined really is that Netlify experience. That's all the orchestration, right? And we also have added what's called Netlify Create. This is part of this now as a new layer, which is really, to be honest, relevant only when you have multiple systems. And that's because you have visual editing. And whenever I say visual editing, people think, oh, we've solved that 25 years ago. Absolutely. But we always solved it as part of one system. And in the composable world, you're saying, well, my marketing department, right? If they need to rethink how they're going to create sites and so on whenever we change the system. And my whole point is that I want to be able to use all of them and not, for example, have to constantly migrate everything over to the system and set everything finished up before I can start using it. Well, then you would really need to abstract that layer away. So that's a visual editing layer that works across all your different content management systems, right? It doesn't do the content modeling. You still need a CMS if you need a CMS. That's not our job. But we've sort of sliced out that layer of orchestration, if you will. So the visual editors have a tool that will work across all these different content sources. Because if you don't, well, then you have the pragmatic challenge of saying, if you want to fully utilize this, you would need sort of have to have 20 of them, right? And that's not how it really works. So you would just choose the one. So all of this is really sort of different sides and angles of how these things are tied together. And so in our world, when it comes to modern web experiences, modern digital experiences, the truth is you need to go out and find best-in-class components that fits your need, right? And just even if you slice out commerce, there's so many different angles. There's the, deep enterprise full service versions of commerce tools. There's commerce layer or something like that will really split out and focus on the transactional layer. Again, you'll often have, well, I have all this functionality in my legacy system, and in this world where I don't have to change everything, actually, I love this part. Could I keep that, please? And then supplement with these parts over here that wasn't working very well, right? And so our job is not to provide any of those components. It is just like your job is not to provide, the HubSpots or the Salesforce, but to make sure that you automate processes of tickets coming across, and it's not the same thing. So in our world, it would be that you can just plug those in freely, and then everything else is taken care of, right? So the operations of it, the orchestration of it is provided by us, and then the components is provided by yourself of your vendors.
Okay. Chris, that makes a lot of sense, and it really sounds like Netlify becomes the glue for that digital experience. You're providing that
exactly
that mesh that's holding everything together.
Yeah.
And I'm curious a little bit with that type of scenario, how that changes if you think of like a traditional there's been a lot of evolutions. You started talking about the story, and it brought me back to some things I hadn't thought about a long time, like Flash and doing a lot of web develop, dynamic web development back in the in the late 90s and stuff, and think about how that's evolved. You know, when we think about what you know, even the definition of what's a traditional web development team and what that stack, it's changed so much. But let's say where most companies are right now, where maybe they're, you know, in the mid-market and lower, they're often using a WordPress. Other companies, they're using some framework of some kind with maybe a scripting layer. They haven't really migrated to headless. Someone's on this sort of more traditional paradigm. And you think of that team, how that evolved, because you've got these different layers in the team, right? You've still got back-end developers. You've got these front-end specialists who, you know, become real, especially JavaScript specialists. You've got creatives. You've got all this coming together on that team. And how does the makeup of that team shift? Say if I've got a company and I've got my web team, and now I'm going to say, you know what, I'm going to move to the new world. I want to go where things are going. I want to adopt Netlify. How does my team change? How does the makeup and the weighting of a team change with those given roles?
No, it's a very good question, right? It's the right question, and it's something I spend a lot of time with. I feel like when we sit with large enterprise and organizations and moving over, then that change management is always a central part of the story, right? And very often we'll be working with SIs and so on, like that specialized consultants that come in and help making those changes and facilitate that. But I think in essence, at core, it means that developers that are building out those APIs and are making those compiling the code for compiling what needs to be done for building out the website before it's actually built and distributed by us. Those you get more of, and then anyone that was associated with the operations, right? Spinning up staging environments and caching, there's an infrastructure engineers like the DevOps and system administrators. They get to spend their time on stuff that's more that's less about keeping the lights on and more about building out new functionality that will create business value. And so I think what changes there, and I remember one of the early ones, there was an agency up in Portland, and the technical director, he was also an author of an open source tool in our space. So he really understood what was happening. And I think he had a team of about 35 people, and as far as I remember, something like 29 of them were, would be in the back end bucket. And then once they transferred to doing this way, I think 31 were front end or developers building out projects, right? And only 4 of them were back end because they didn't really need a lot, right? Like they were doing campaign sites and so on, and for that there wasn't any back end, right? And if there was, it was something that was a standalone service that you can just plug in. There was not a lot of operation and maintenance involved in it. And so I think like the change management often becomes that what you're spending on your infrastructure and operating it is what's being migrated away, right? And I would imagine maybe seeing a little bit of the same in Celigo. So my theory, like to spin on that a little bit, right? What I'm seeing now is I would call it the biggest shift since the move from on-prem to cloud in our world, right? And we went from on-prem to cloud, and you can also argue that's still happening for sure, but it's been a mega trend for more than a decade, right? And what we did that in principle because of scalability, because of multitude of services, right? So AWS have all these services, for example, right? And they can spin up more EC2 service than you can. But it was always operations as usual. It's like a Home Depot. You're coming, you're getting your building blocks, right? But you have to, an outside consultancy, someone has to take those building blocks and build something with it and optimize it and upgrade it and operate it and so on. And I think you're going to see CIOs within a couple of years, and I also think that this plays into what AI is coming in and doing, right? Where a CIO is going to say, like, one of our goals for this coming year is going to be, let's not run, to the extent possible, our own infrastructure clouds. And I don't mean by our own as an alternative to GCP or AWS, but just building on those building blocks. That's what I'm seeing something like Netlify being able to abstract away. Of course, we do it for the digital experiences, right? And there's other parts of the IT stacks as well, right? But for that is really that value add, right? And so if you look as a company, as a CIO or CIO, for example, right, when I have those conversations, they're looking at this and saying, well, this is the biggest budget spend, right? Most business problems today have digital solutions. If I look to what goes into this, it's massive, right? I just had a conversation last week with someone that said that out of their $125 million budget, 85 of them just went to keeping the lights on because they had so much legacy tech and there was just so much overhead and resources in running this, right? That is nonsensical. That should stop, and it can't stop, right? And that's our mission, and I would imagine it's a joint mission because a lot of that is also what I see as yours value add, right? But of course, that has big changes and implications for that organization, right? Those people that were now don't have to operate in the same way. Well, if you ask any company like that, any IT department, do you have a list of things you would like to do if you didn't spend all your time here? There's this long list, right? And that's often where all that value add is, but you don't have time for it because you're trying to make sure that the card house doesn't crumble, right? So at the end of the day, I often see that, hey, like this is just a win, right? Because now you're able to utilize these people in a much, much better way. But yeah, change management is a very big part of this point.
And that really resonates. What you just said, we haven't talked about the CIO backlog is something we talk a lot to CIOs about. They've got this automation backlog. They know they keep adding apps. It's hard to say no to solve these problems, but then they add them. And they don't get integrated, or the integration is reactionary. Automation becomes reactionary instead of leading with automation. And so that backlog, it's like being on a hamster wheel because the team's trying to connect everything and build it as fast. But if you're using legacy tools and you're focusing so much of the team's time on keeping the lights on, if you will, right? Especially if they're using more legacy coded approaches or some legacy very code intensive tools, you're not focusing on really the crux of that work is often the business process side. So you're not putting I mean, that's the bottleneck, but you've got so much effort going into the dev. And now by using more modern tools, you can shift. And that was what really stood out to me when you described the shifting of those teams going from having way more front-end developers and far fewer back-end developers. Because if I'm going to step back and I'm going to be a business leader, and I'm going to say my web presence, I'm concerned about the business impact of my web presence. How is it communicating my message with the experience it's giving my customers and partners? And I don't care about the back-end. Like a CEO or the CMO or you literally don't care as long as it works and it meets certain requirements. And until it doesn't, literally there's really no business appreciation for it because it's irrelevant to the business goal, but yet it's so critical for meeting those goals. But if you tell me that I can have 90% of my team, if I'm a CIO trying to meet the needs of the rest of the company, you tell me that 90% of my team can now be focused on the front end, on the user experience to deliver that experience. I mean, that to me is like that's the same value proposition we have. We're like, oh, we can involve the business technologists that are involved on the front lines instead of having to rely on developers. It's the same thing, and I wonder if you see the same effect on organizations where you now see we see an acceleration of automation, meaning they're doing more. It grows to the organization. They connect things more quickly. Everything starts working better. It kind of becomes a snowball. Do you see the same thing from a user experience and like a maturity of the digital experience?
Absolutely, 100%, right? I think the CIO and CEOs often like the big things that we're helping with is faster time to market and then reducing that overhead, right? And if we talk to some, like there's different roles, right? But if I look at an e-commerce manager or talk to them or a CMO, for example, right? Then performance is a huge part of it, right? All of a sudden you have these things that are global by default and has time to first by milliseconds, right? And that means the world for conversion, right? I mean, like speed is just it's such a basic part. We've known it for 25 years. It's not a new concept. We've always known. I remember the early Amazon and Google and Yahoo reports that are more than a decade old, like they came out, right? And just said like, what does 100 millisecond and extra time to first byte mean, right? And that it's hugely important, right? So they get that. But it's the time to market. I spoke to the CMO from a large financial institution, and they had a self-service product that did billions, right? That's really significant, right? So that's credit card forms, right? he told me that they had a 45-second combined load time, 45 seconds, right? And we're talking about Deloitte Digital coming out saying that 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second, can mean 8% conversion rate change, right? So 45 seconds. And of course, it's because regulations require that you put in a lot of different information and so on. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because he said, even with that, his number one challenge was time to market. Like he sat on these very, well, I'm not going to name any names, but on monolithic providers. And he said, like, everything touches each other. Like, I can't move. I'm stuck in molasses, right? I want to change this one thing. And for the reasons we talked about earlier, it takes me 4 months to do it, which also means that all the optimization, all the smaller experiments, I don't have time to do that at all. Or it doesn't even make sense to do a small tweak in the color of a call to action button and then seeing the results 4 months later, because so much else has to change. We have new campaign updates and all these things. Unless I can do it more or less real time, like it really has to go fast, it stops being meaningful, right? And you start seeing a lot of people doing less personalization for the same reasons, which makes no sense. We've all known that A/B testing and personalization is one-on-one best practice, but the pragmatic reality is that the time to market stops that, right? So I think if you get that performance boost of just having something that's plain and simple, really, really fast loading, and then you get that sort of, hey, I automated all these other steps, so you can now start publishing all the time to production. Then it's fun to be them, right? You still need the right components, right? You still need the right headless APIs. It's not a thing that stands alone, but from a workflow point of view, that's where the value really lies.
Yeah, Chris, and I think that time to value and that being able to move quickly, and if it takes too long, now you can't even follow best practices, the A/B testing, the iterative approach. And having led an e-commerce company before, it's often you think of these big technology projects as being the ones that are going to affect the most change. And the reality was you got the most change from the little things, from evolving the evolution, this sort of trial and error of evolution of doing these little things, testing it. Did it work? Did it not? Okay, we got a 1/10% of a conversion. Well, when you're talking about millions of dollars, potentially a day, that's a big deal. That's a massive impact. And so you look at these things, and then you evolve this, and it's the sum total of a series of small changes that together evolve you in a direction that if you sat down and you try to come up with this magical vision, that magical vision is almost never right. It might get you pointed directionally correct, but it's the rest of that evolution. And if you can't do that, like if an organization can't make those changes and they find like, well, we can't tune this. And if you find that you can't tune, and that really, it doesn't matter whether it's the website, it doesn't matter whether it's their business systems or accounting software, anything. If you're in a situation where you're like, I don't feel like I can tune anything because I'm worried it's going to break or it's going to take too long. That's a fundamental, I mean, that is a massive signal that you're going to fall behind. Right, because other companies, leading companies can, and we see that. I know you're seeing that. They're getting and they're realizing, well, we have to stay agile. And I think that agility, if I look back over the last few years, it's been the biggest thing that's been hammered home is can you be agile or can you not? And if you can't, you're going to succeed. And we see the current economic pressures, and that only accelerates it, honestly.
I agree 100%.
So speaking of agility, it seems like and we talk about AI on this podcast pretty frequently, so I'm feeling obligated to bring it up. But it seems like AI is something that enhances agility for businesses, for brands, for individuals, whether it's someone like me who's kind of doing more marketing side, or even engineers and people who are coding and things like that. So I'm kind of curious. I want to combine two questions. What's next in terms of Netlify? In terms of what you're developing, maybe it's a product, maybe it's a release coming out, or maybe just a vision in general. And if so, does AI tie into that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, AI is a big thing, right? So we were just having our offsite this week, and we're also talking about it, right? Because I think there's a lot of companies right now that coming in and they're leading with AI. It's almost like a buzzword, right? Where it used to be Web3 or something else, right? And I think in 6 months you're going to see a lot of sort of people saying, well, actually that one AI product they had sort of didn't create any value. Maybe it just created overhead, right? But it had AI in the title, right?
Sounded good.
So I'm a little cautious of that. I think when it comes to AI, there's several points of view. Like one is that when I talk to companies and CEOs again, to talk about that part of our audience, right? It's like, I would say 97% is actually not about new functionality. It's about abstraction, right? It's about automating something that used to be manual, right? Then of course, there's also those things that come out that truly sort of us, now we can do this, or we have enough compute power, we have whatever, to be able to do something that truly didn't exist already, or bring in a new standard or something like that, right? And in the web space, there are definitely some things that could happen there. But the vast majority is about like automation, really. So it's a complete extenuation of what we've already been doing, right? Which is abstracting, automating things away. Now, for us, it's very important that we are good and can have qualified, with our CSO, our head of legal, and so on, has spent a lot of time really understanding how does this work for enterprises. When can you leave in? When can you? What data are you share? How are you sharing? How you compartmentalize this, and so on, right? So there's a whole side of AI there that's very important. And then when it comes to our services, it's a very big thing. So we have a number of actual products and add-ons coming out that are completely AI driven, but already now there's tons of it, right? So if you use our documentation, you can just ask, and they'll come up with answers, right? That are contextual and everything, right? Inside the product, we're adding a lot of smart functionality, and it's almost coming out the door. So we just had the presentation, a bunch of stuff yesterday, so we're quite excited about that. But I would say, generally speaking, it has to further that mission, right? And then the last part, which I think is really interesting and important in our space, and I'm curious to hear what it looks like in your space, but when I speak to startups every day. I think I sit on quite a number of advisory boards, a ton of angel investments, because we were so dependent on an ecosystem growing up around us that we've been heavily involved in that since the very beginning. But I get pitched daily with different AI solutions, right? And if you, for example, look at the front-end frameworks and the AI agents in that space, and whether that is going to really come from the design tools, right, of them being native code as well, and how that whole process is, I would say the only thing as an enterprise that you can be sure of is that you can't pick a winner today. Like, it's simply like there's thousands of bits and it might not be any of them, right? And so in my world, it's really important that you're setting yourself up to be able to take a component and use it with as little friction as possible, and then discontinue it if you will have to use something else. That's much more important than trying to find that right agent or the right model today, because it most likely isn't it. And so if you're double clicking on that and you're locking yourself in, there's going to be real trouble, probably like in 3 months, because it's extremely iterative right now, which is exciting. I love it, right? And I do see that our mission of abstracting these things away and automating away, they're only being supercharged. We only move so much faster in our services to our clients with AI. But it's not my job to come with an AI product to the client. It's my job, Netlify's job, to use AI to make it, to make the services they need of take this out of my way, right? Or help me do this as good as possible. AI is sort of a tool rather than an end result, which I think in these high times is sometimes confused a little bit. And then Netlify's job is really to provide the right plumbing, the right infrastructure, the right operational orchestration for you to use all these different components, rather than saying it has to be a specific one of them. So there's different angles here, but that's sort of from a helicopter point of view how we think about it.
That's awesome. Thank you. I appreciate you kind of clarifying the nuances there, because I think some people kind of just splat AI on the wall, and there's, like you said, there's a lot more nuance to it. So we got about 5 minutes left, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, Chris. Mark, before I kind of wrap things up, any last minute questions or comments or anything that you'd like to go over with Chris?
Well, Jordan, I think Chris and I could sit here and we could talk about this stuff pretty much all day. So, let alone if we had a couple beers involved. So, I think we've got, I think we covered a lot here, and I really love these synergies between thinking about the way around between both the ways that we're approaching automation for organizations, but from different directions. And I really like thinking about that, because there's multiple vectors that companies have to be thinking about this. And for me, this actually gives me this actually filled in something in my thinking, especially having had web development teams in the past, and kind of moving away from it over the last several years. I'm like, wow, this is where it's going. This fits in really nicely to be like, okay, this is the modern automated paradigm for that. And we think about like, and I think we're all collectively trying to evolve and create this vision of what's the modern digital enterprise look like, and what are all the pieces that fit in to create a completely automated, as much as possible, organization. And it's not defined. It's just like you were saying, Chris. All these with AI is a component of that. There's a whole area there, and it kind of adds as a layer, but it's still evolving. We're trying to figure that out. So for me, this has kind of helped fill in part of that picture really well. But I don't have any more questions because I got to stop myself somewhere. So we'll stop here.
Well, I'll say two things. One, as in this podcast particular, being an observer, it's very cool to see the cusp of what you were mentioning, Mark, kind of the future of kind of technology and what's going to be next on the frontier. So I just feel very privileged to be able to listen to you guys. And I'd say the second thing that this brings up is obviously, Chris, we'd love to have you back on the podcast because clearly we can talk about this for a long time. Maybe we'll move it a little bit later in the day on a Friday and actually have some beers. With that in mind, we got about 3 minutes, but I always like to ask this just to round out the podcast and make sure that the listeners understand that you are not just a robot of technology. But if you could tell the listeners, Chris, a little bit about yourself outside of work, any passions, hobbies, or interests that you you care that you're into, and then we'll wrap things up.
Very much. I got bitten by the bug when I studied film history. So I totally geek out on movies, everything from silent movies up to modern action movies and everything in between. So I've always been that kind of audiovisual communication stays with me in that way. I like driving cars. I feel like I have ADHD, and so when I'm driving on a racetrack, it totally focuses me and centers me, right? It almost makes me feel calm, and I kind of like that. And art. So I love art, going to galleries and museums and researching online and just creative ways of expressing yourself, right? Like art can be so many different things, of course, but yeah, celebrating and diving into and researching the beautiful things in life is fun, right?
That's fantastic, man. It seems like both you and I have a lot of overlapping interests. That's cool to hear. And I'm a car nut too, so I'm sure we could do a whole nother car podcast without Mark, where Chris and I could talk a bunch.
Let's do let's follow up 3 podcasts.
I'm down. We're starting new podcasts here. Well, with that in mind, I just want to wrap things up so everyone can get back to the rest of their day. But Chris, thank you so much for being on this podcast. To our listeners who've made it this far, thank you for joining us on the Celigo Technology Leaders podcast. Mark, as always, thanks for being my trusty co-host.
Thank you.
We'll see you guys in a couple weeks after the holiday break. We have some really fantastic guests lined up. But Chris, thank you so much for joining us, and see you, everybody. Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.